The Timemore Sculptors were all the rage when they were released on Kickstarter back in 2023, and now they've been out for a while and I've had plenty of time to play with all these. Initially I just got the 064S and the 078 as a prototype to review, but since then I've also received the production unit of the 078S. And besides that, we've finally also gotten some aftermarket burrs for the 078 model. Got these ones here from Lebrew, so we are also going to be talking about that because I've had plenty of time to play around with them now. So I thought it was time for an update. What are my thoughts on these grinders in 2025, and does the addition of new burrs change everything? Let's dive into it. The first thing I want to start talking about is the price. When the Sculptors were released on Kickstarter, they were $300 and $500 respectively, and that was a really fantastic deal. But now they have gotten a lot more expensive, and I'm not sure all of that is just due to inflation, because it's $600 and $800 respectively. So that obviously changes things quite a bit. So in this review, I'll also reflect on those higher expectations that come with those higher prices. But first, let's talk about user experience. I think overall, the Sculptors are really outstanding grinders in terms of UX. In daily life, they are really nice to use. The sound and the sound quality of the grinders is nice, both with and without beans. Retention is low most of the time. I'll come back to that later. The grinders also have some nice small touches, and a lot of reviews have already talked about this little clicker mechanism here instead of the regular knocker. This is just a lot more intuitive and nice to use, and it works really well. There's another nice little touch I've come to appreciate, and that is this angle front here, because that means if you have a little bit of grounds that has fallen down, a little bit of static, then you can just put your hand here and then you can kind of like brush it off. I haven't really seen any other grinders that do it this way. Most of them would just have like a straight edge here. So this shows that there's been a lot of thought put into the design. Of course, you do have the RPM dial on the backside of the grinder, so you may need to reach behind it. But personally, for me, it's not a big deal because usually I'll run it at either the slowest or fastest settings. So it's pretty easy to adjust, even if you have to put your arm around it when it's on the kitchen counter. When you do open up the grinder to clean them out, you will also see that the burr chamber in general is very well constructed. You don't find much retained coffee at all. I would say it's very, very little, and you won't have to clean it very often. Maybe you don't even have to clean it at all if you only drink light roast. Perhaps you're using the 078 for drip coffee, then most likely it's not even worth the hassle. There are only two issues that will probably annoy users long term. And the first one is that it's a lot more challenging to open than other grinders. So if you need to align the burrs, it just takes a lot longer time. Probably you'll have to add at least 10 to 15 minutes in workflow every time you need to open it up and put a shim under the burr. And if you have to shim the burrs repeatedly, then it does add up over time. So probably you wouldn't want to switch burrs very often, but if you just have to do it once, switching from stock burrs to SSP or Lebrews, then it's really not that bad. Another slightly annoying aspect of the user experience is the hopper design here. There's a very slim kind of anti-popcorning grid that doesn't do a great job of keeping the beans inside the grinding chamber, so they will frequently popcorn out here. And then because the hopper has a very shallow angle, then the beans will actually not fall back down into the grinding chamber. Maybe you'll have a little shrapnel just stuck on the side, and then if you experience some retention, it's most likely because there's a little bit of some bean fragments stuck around here on the edges. However, there's actually one very easy solution to this, and that is just getting Timemore's own extension hopper. So you just take off the lid like so, and then you attach it, no tools involved, and it has a very snug fit here. So in daily use, it just feels like you got a taller hopper, and maybe it makes the design a little bit more odd with this protruding hopper. I find that it's actually pretty good looking here on the bigger version. On the smaller one, slightly more of a weird design. Now it becomes a little bit odd looking, but actually I almost find it looks better on the white 078S because it has that kind of transparent hopper. So it just looks a little bit more sculpted with this extension piece. Now, I know you're probably really curious about how the Lebrew Hyperburrs perform in the 78, and I've installed them here in the 78S. So first I'll show you how they work for espresso. I have 16 grams here in my dosing cup, and I'm grinding espresso at the setting 2. So let's just time them and see how long time it takes. So that's around 12 seconds for a 16 gram shot. So definitely pretty nice. And for me, the sound of the burrs and the grinder together when they're grinding for espresso is actually not bad at all. I think it's definitely in the top level when it comes to quiet grinders. And we have 15.9 grams out. Let me just see if there's anything stuck here. Yeah, there's actually a tiny little bean shrapnel stuck here. So let's see when we add it to the, yeah, not enough to make it turn, but overall very low retention. So right now I'm grinding at setting 2, and I've mostly been here around 3 to 2, so I can quite easily choke any espresso machine with these burrs. And actually there's a little bit more range. I haven't even calibrated it to chirp, because I also need the range for drip coffee, which I'm grinding at around 16 to 18. So you really have a very good working range with these Lebrew Burrs. Now let's brew some filter coffee, and then we'll talk more about the taste and flavors. And now I'm just going to grind 8 grams. I still have some of Hofmann's decaf coffee, which is perfect for a night like this. And here's how it looks, and as you can see, it's a little bit uneven, and at first that was a little bit scary to me how uneven it is, but the taste is still pretty good. We'll talk more about that later. And I'll put it up against the Ghost Burrs here. And these grounds just look a lot more even. And I'm just going to use my standard switch recipe, just modified a little bit to this smaller format. I'm only brewing 8 grams of coffee. Okay, so actually 2 surprisingly similar cups, and that's been my impression during most of this testing period. I was actually really surprised just how sweet and kind of mild and subtle the flavors were with the filter burrs. When you say filter burrs, you would kind of automatically assume maybe some more clarity, some more acidity, but these ones are leaning very much in the different direction, a more blended, sweet and comforting direction. The slightly weird thing about the Lebrew Burrs is that they are actually almost the opposite of the stock espresso burrs. With the stock burrs, you just have a ton of acidity and not a lot of sweetness. The Lebrew Burrs, they do the opposite thing. They prioritize sweetness and body. I must admit, initially when I got them, I was a little bit disappointed, but then I spent a lot of extra time aligning the burrs perfectly, getting that perfect vibe at just minimal burr touch, and seasoning them more. In the beginning, they also produced a ton of static. All this seemed to really help. And then there's also the other side of the coin, that is, I probably got more used to the results. I did some blind taste tests, and they actually punched way above their weight, and occasionally also won some rounds against these 2 grinders here. I have SSP brew burrs in the small 64mm, and as you might already know, the Ghost Burrs in the 078 are also really solid performers. So I was a little bit surprised by this. Since they are called filter burrs, initially I expected a lot of clarity, transparency, acidity, that kind of profile, but they don't really deliver that. Instead, they offer a rounded, slightly blended presentation. I was skeptical at first, but they are slowly starting to grow much more on me, these burrs here. And flavor-wise, I find that they actually lean quite close to the 78 Turbo Burrs, much more than the SSP burrs. They're sweet, very approachable. If you look at the grinds up close, you can also see that they look kind of uneven. There's a big mix of fines and boulders, so don't expect anything with ultra high clarity. But somehow they still produce quite good cups where you can pick up flavor notes, but in a very gentle, rounded way. For espresso, they also work pretty well. As you saw, when you're grinding for espresso, they practically work like regular espresso burrs. And in terms of flavors, you also get a lot of sweetness. You get body and texture. Again, not much clarity, I wouldn't recommend them for that. For Americanos, they are pretty bad. When you dilute the cups more, they become pretty mottled. You only just get sweetness and body without any distinct kind of flavor notes. So to wrap it up, are the Lebrew Burrs game changers for the Sculptor series? In my opinion, no. There are cheaper grinders and other burr sets, even Lebrew's own 64mm filter or sweet burr sets that probably offer more in terms of clarity, both when it comes to filter coffee and espresso. However, if you already own a 78 grinder, 78S especially, and you want something that can do the same, both work for espresso and filter, you want to try something new, well, this is one of your only options, and I think for some people it will probably be a better option. On the other hand, if you have the 078 with the turbo ghost burrs, then switching might feel like a bit of a downgrade because there is a more muddiness, especially in the aftertaste. It's not quite as subtle and delicate. So overall, I would say I'm pretty happy that these burrs exist, but when you consider the $800 price point for this grinder, and you add $139 for these burrs, then we're getting up to a pretty high neighborhood, and you have many other options there. Now let's turn our attention to this one here, the original Sculptor 078 that has these turbo burrs that are kind of ghost burrs, so a special type of burrs that is not kind of the traditional flat burr. And for me, using this grinder has been a little bit of a love-hate relationship. Is probably a little bit strong. I had some really amazing coffees with the 078, especially those with really great inherent flavors, very fruity coffees, but coffees that are more still specialty coffee but are scoring more down in that 82, 84 points range. They might not shine in the same way. If it's about chocolate, nuts, those type of beans, that type of coffee can feel like a little bit too transparent and lackluster with the 078. I have a long blog post about the grinder where I go more into detail about all these flavor distinctions. I'll put a link to it down below. Now to talk about the 64S, and actually I don't think Timemore sells the 64, the regular filter version that also has smaller ghost burrs anymore. Now it's only the espresso version, and the original espresso burrs inside them, I find them, they were pretty good for a grinder that was $300 as the original Kickstarter price. They did a decent job at espresso. Filter coffee was also possible. I think now at $600, gotta ask yourself, is it really living up to that? I think I have higher expectations at that level. So I think many people, they would probably want to upgrade with either Lebrew or SSP burrs. There are really many options available in this size. And the most important thing here to remember is just that the tolerances are very tight. So you need to find a burr set that is exactly 64mm, not 64.1 or 64.2, because then you might have trouble getting them to fit inside. And that means some older SSP burrs, they might not fit. I will say now at $600, it's leaning a little bit more into that higher end premium price range of 64mm grinders. We are seeing more and more grinders coming out with this size of burrs and with a lot of the features that are pretty similar to the Sculptor. That being said, it's still a very tiny grinder, especially if you just use it the stock way, and it looks great on the countertop. So to sum everything up about the Sculptor series, I think if you back them on the Kickstarter, you got a really great deal. You ended up with a lot of grinder for the money. As things stand today, I think the 078 especially has really carved out its own niche. It's a one-of-a-kind grinder. You might really love the flavor profile or you might not, but there's not really anything else like it on the market. For the 64S, there are plenty of other grinders that can do essentially the same thing. It's a decent platform for good 64mm burrs and it looks fantastic. But nowadays with the $600 price tag, it's a little bit more in competition with a lot of other grinders in the price range. Still a very attractive option though. As for the 078S, I'm not really the biggest fan of the stock burrs for espresso, but if you're looking for a dual purpose grinder, it does perform pretty well for both filter coffee and espresso. For $800 I think the DF83V delivers probably better results for the price. It might not look as good or be as polished, but I think the UX is just a little bit better overall, and it's much easier to swap burrs, and you have a lot more burr options available at that 83mm size. I haven't had a chance to test out the new 78mm SSP burrs for this grinder, They have a geometry that looks very similar to Lebrew's. Based on what I've seen from other reviewers, they seem to be a little bit similar to Lebrew's, maybe a little bit more acidic, but at the same level in terms of is it groundbreaking or not. Most people seem to lean towards not that groundbreaking. And I think that's an important aspect when we're talking about bigger burrs, because they tend to be more expensive. So for that extra money, the 78mm burrs from SSPs are $350 as far as I know. So for that kind of money, you really want to expect something that's a lot better than 64mm burrs. If they're just faster and have longer life before they get dull, then it's less interesting if you're a home user. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on the Sculptor grinders and the new burr options in 2025. If you happen to own any of these, I would also be curious to hear your opinion down below. And if you want to read more about the Lebrew Burrs or the 78 special flavor profile, then I have an in-depth review over on my blog, so I'll put links to that down below. That's it for today. I will see you in another coffee video very soon.